Hello, and you are listening to Bill Murphy's Red Zone podcast. I interview leaders who inspire me in the areas of exponential technologies, business innovation, entrepreneurship, thought leadership, enterprise IT security, neuroscience, philosophy, personal development, and more. Welcome to the show. Welcome back to the show, everyone. This is Bill Murphy, your host of the Red Zone podcast. Today, I have a really interesting conversation. Now, everyone, I want you to be aware that today is a deep dive on security on the Google's cloud security platform. But this is really interesting because my guest is David Cross, and David came on the show 2 years ago when he was the GM of security at Microsoft Azure. And I just learned a ton about Microsoft Azure security at that time. And then he went over to Google and is now the director of cloud security at Google. And David is just fantastically intelligent. He has over 2 years ago, he had 25 patents, and now I think it's over 30 patents that he's developed. So he's a prolific, very creative problem solver with security and with technology. And so he has an MBA in management information systems. He was an active duty military focused on aviation, electronic warfare community with the US Navy. And he speaks at RSA regularly. And I just talked to him after he had talked at RSA for Google this past year. And we talked a lot about the BeyondCorp model. So I want executives to understand how deeply Google is investing in security and what their thesis is. And there's a lot of very interesting strategies that Google has deployed. And I want you to understand this. So we're going to talk today about the BeyondCorp model. And we're going to talk about user identity, code as an identity, and device identity. And underlying this, as David says, that Google's strategy is the right code running on the right machine, authorized by the right identity to access the right data at the right time. I love that. So we're going to talk about the Identity-Aware Proxy strategy with Google and how this can help you with your anti-phishing problems that you're having within your organizations, the importance of two-factor authentication. We're going to get into the FIDO UTF protocols and the right security keys to be running. And we're going to talk about this 9-layer stack at Google that goes all the way down to the firmware, the trusted boot, BIOS, cryptographically verified microcode. We're going to get down into why this 9-layer stack strategy that Google has is so powerful for security moving forward. So if you previously listened to David and my first interview with him, you're going to love this one as we talk about Google's security strategy from what I believe is a world-class engineer. So I hope you enjoyed this interview with David, and with no further waiting, this is my conversation with David Cross. Welcome you to the show today.
Thanks, Bill. I was really excited to be back on the show after, it's been 2 years now?
It's been just about 2 years, and it was a really fascinating conversation we originally had 2 years ago. And actually, I might even link up to it. It's on the show notes. It was really fun to talk to you when you were on the other side of the fence, when you're on the Microsoft side of the fence, and now you're on the Google side of the fence.
Yes, I hate to kind of crossing over, but this is what the cloud's about, and we're all evolving. And I'm a big fan of podcasts, and coming back on is a great opportunity. Certainly, I'm a regular follower of your podcast because I always get to meet new people and things. And likewise, just like Google's constantly evolving our cloud podcast as well. So I really encourage everyone to kind of join and follow.
Yeah, and one of the interesting interviews I had recently was with the CIO of Experian, and actually their chief innovation officer as well. So I kind of talked to two guys that work pretty closely with one another in separate interviews. And the CIO had a really interesting point. He said to me, and of course, this guy, is one of the Fortune 20, 30, 50. I mean, it's up at the top. And he says, I want to be able to move all my workloads in between clouds, in between Amazon, Azure, Google. And I thought, God, what a great vision. And he goes, that's possible now. And I thought, God, he's so far down the track. He probably thinks he's behind and everybody else is still trying to move into the cloud securely and successfully. What do you think about that, just from a macro vision point of view?
Well, I think that the reality is everyone is moving to the cloud. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And part of it is how the clouds are evolving, to meet all the needs as you evolve your applications. In some cases, it's a lift and shift. In other cases, it's really, let's re-architect and design the next generation web application, or to microservices, or to containers. And so the one thing that I think we're continuing to see day after day now is that there's a lot of great on-premise applications and services, yet the ability to respond to them in a rapid fashion, right, is become more and more difficult when you're on-premise. And the idea is now to move the apps and the data to the cloud, where you can actually be much faster, much more dynamic, and so that customers can benefit, from the world-class operations, world-class hardware, world-class solutions and analysis. That's not necessarily possible in on-premise in a dynamic fashion today.
It is a big challenge. And one of the things that a lot of CIOs and CISOs are struggling with is, so the first generation people went to the cloud and they didn't give a shit, no pun intended. It's not really a pun, but I didn't mean to didn't mean to swear right there. But they really didn't. They just kind of threw the stuff up there because it was, they just did. And probably because they didn't have a lot of oversight, a lot of regulatory oversight or governance concerns or issues. And I know that for a fact because some CIOs of some high growth companies have literally told me, my CEO does not care. She wants it all in the cloud, or he wants it all in the cloud. So now we find this generation, probably the much bigger population of companies that are moving the cloud, and they're really struggling with creating the design frameworks that they had in the old paradigm, which is sort of everything gets firewalled, WINS, DNS, everything gets put behind the firewall. And so that became like a framework of security and operations that they could handle. Now they're essentially trying to figure out how to firewall the cloud. And every vendor has a different way of doing it. So, and I know that's a very kind of macro comment, but what are your thoughts from that macro piece? And then maybe we can kind of telescope into what your thoughts are and where Google is really winning in regards to that.
Absolutely. I think then this really ties closely to, what we've called, our BeyondCorp model here at Google. And this is one of the attractions of when joining Google and moving to the cloud, is that moving away from just the traditional on-premise or VPN model, using your virtual private network to connect to your data center, that's just not productive and working anymore, right? We need to enforce, access and management at the application level. And because we're all mobile now, I think I don't even want to count the number of devices I have. And I was on vacation last week, I'm always mobile and I'm around the world. I'm not always in one location. And so the idea is what Google has in moving to the cloud is really how you can actually expose your internal applications, your data, right, in ways where the user, the device, the code, and all the context of your location and other things can be the context of which you have access or not. And we built out this model, and this is how it's performed at Google today, and how we're making that available through our customers, with our beta of our Identity-Aware Proxy service. It's a completely different model because the firewalls are still in the cloud, but it's not just about the traditional model of firewall out and you VPN in. That's old school, to be honest.
Okay, so firewall out, VPN in. I think everybody's going to get that has been in the technology world for a while. So essentially, you're looking at more of a proxy-based approach that's able to grab context. And just for those that are less technical, So the context of this would be, well, maybe you can give us some ideas of context, because I think context is king in this world, and maybe we can drive into that a little bit about what you mean and what Google means by context.
Absolutely. So let me start with what it means to be that. So when you look at the overall data, so with your application, it becomes about data. And so then you want to know of what users are going to have access to that data. And so that you actually want strong identity and strong authentication. Then building upon that, saying, well, now that you understand the user that should have access to it, then what devices should they use? Should they be able to use a corporate laptop? Should they be able to use a Chromebook? Should they be able to use their phone, right? And how are those provisioned? So the context of the device is the identity of the device, but also the status of the device, right? Is it up to date, right? Has it been secured? Is it been provisioned and managed, by the organization? That's the second part of context. The third is what location. And in some cases, based on regulatory or other needs, is saying that it's one thing that, yes, I'm on premise, in the corporate network, or yes, I'm connected from a home location here in Washington State, or no, I'm traveling overseas, right, in an untrusted location or country in some cases, based on regulatory needs. And saying that, well, maybe that is a context and factor that should be played into the decision of access. And then last but not least is then what application, right, should have access to the data. So there's one thing when you look at the storage in the cloud that you can say you may be running a data processing application or machine learning application, and that application should have access to the data. But then there's another application that is a game application. Let's say your favorite game from Steam. Should that have access to that data? Probably not. And so the context and the identity of the data itself is very, very important. And then having that policy so you can actually have a very secure location or a secure decision in a mobile world.
What advantages does this give versus over the VPN firewall model? Is it because of the complexity of the many different devices that essentially you're saying that people are going to lose if it's just, because the old-fashioned model is this particular device, the firewall or the VPN would check the integrity of that device, maybe find some key or something that was resident placed there by the company, say, okay, this is a device that's allowed in, and it came in. But it's just using essentially a device identifier. What you're saying is that the goal of the Google security framework is to look at multiple different pieces of data, of which that may be one, to say whether or not this is a trusted user, a trusted device to come in?
Yeah, absolutely. The way I like to think about it is, I think it's also it's important, which I was implying earlier. It's about how we think about code as an identity at the application layer, just like we think of the user identity and the device identity. And so the way we like to think about it is we kind of have a saying. It's the right code running on the right machine, authorized by the right identity, accessing the right data at the right time. And it's putting all those things together, because you may have the right identity, you may have the right machine, and the question is, are you accessing from the right location and from the right application itself? Because there's one thing that thinking about like a VPN connection is, yes, it's David Cross, and this is his laptop, and therefore anything that's running on his machine should have access to the data. That's too broad. That's dangerous. Versus, no, this application, in addition with its identity, having access to the data that's specific to that application. That's another way to think about it as well.
That's a really interesting one, is the code as identity. And so the right code, the right machine, the right data, the right time, and the right application. So essentially that pool is the goal from this proxy model that you referred to, this using the word BeyondCorp. Is it called BeyondCorp? Is the overall?
BeyondCorp is kind of the model we've been talking about for several years now. And we're now coming out, we have a beta product called the Identity-Aware Proxy that's building upon this concept and how we can actually start enabling customers over time to actually be able to make decisions on those various contextual attributes and when users and machines have access and applications have access to data.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is that the context of this is going to be king, and it's hard to put that together right now in the current model because of the different devices and different services running that are gathering this information, and nobody's really pulling it all together.
Yes. And the other element of it is also looking at the user identity, but it's also how did the user authenticate? We all know whether it's on-premise or in the cloud, phishing is still the number one entry point, for attackers and risks. And it continues to this day, regardless of the location of the application or the company. And how we move to strong authentication, right? That even if the user's password is stolen, without that device, without that token, without that key, that identity is still useless. and how over time, right, you can actually have re-authentication and forcing the sessions to be closed or re-authenticated to eliminate those risks. We have to move to that model long term because phishing still is the number one attack vector for all compromises and breaches.
So what you're saying there is, in a practical example, if someone receives a phishing email and is redirected to a site, or kind of in the whole attack chain,
Yes.
are you saying that the certs on that site typically don't exist, or maybe you can just kind of reverse engineer that for me, because I'm interested in, if they're in the Google Cloud, how will this ultimately work that would be helpful?
Sure. So one way to think about it is that we have a two-factor authentication device. Historically, these have been the smart cards and certificates, and now using OAuth and our YubiKeys, the idea is that you have to have username and password, and also a provisioned key or device, right, that's tied to your identity, so that not only just your username and password is also the key of your device that's already been provisioned by the company, that goes in addition to your username and password. And so that we can, even if you try to connect to something without that key and that piece of hardware that's in the trusted machine or device, because you can also use it with a phone, through Bluetooth or NFC, then you can actually have the strong authentication. So even if they stole my phone, even if they stole my laptop, they need all three. They need the laptop, they need the key, they need my username, they need my password. And it makes the actual taking over of my identity extremely, very, very difficult. So the context of all of them.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, that made the key for me. So basically, you're essentially putting like a trusted, is that movie where the guy talks about the part of the circle, the part of the trusted circle? It was a comedy. Basically, you have to be part of it. Essentially, what you articulated there was like a triumvirate of three different keys would be together. And if that was subverted, that would be a flag.
Yes, we support this actually in both not just the enterprise, but also the consumer space, right? So that having, anything that uses the FIDO, UTF protocol, right? And having these keys tied to your account, it's very, very powerful. And so even if you are phished and they take your password, it's not going to be effective or usable without your key, your physical key.
That is a very powerful. So right now, from the beta point of view, is that currently being offered now, or is it's something that you're building into the Identity-Aware Proxy service?
Actually, using Google Cloud Platform or G Suites or Google Identities with the user keys, security keys, that is available today. And so now we're tying all these other things into our Identity-Aware Proxy beta for Google Cloud-based applications, so that you can set these requirements based on your identity and then enforcing them through our proxy.
Very, very interesting. One of the things I had a question about was, you and I had talked about the building trust in any cloud service provider.
Right.
And we talked about how this trust is being established on the Google platform. Could you kind of go through that a little bit? Because I think that is a big deal for people, is how we trust our cloud providers. And I'd love to hear how you guys are doing that.
Absolutely. So I think as we mentioned before, when customers are moving to the cloud, right, it's a virtual space. They do not get to see and touch everything like they do with their on-premises. And the idea that we think about at Google, we run everything in the cloud. And so we want to make sure that we enable customers to have the same protection, detection, and defense capabilities that we use, so our customers can have the same. Now, the way we really think about the cloud platform is, and I've talked about before, like RSA last year, we think about it as a 9-layer stack, right? From the hardware all the way up to the user level. So, and we think of it as kind of like the old network layers, right? But this one's a 9-layer. It's about the hardware. It's about how you boot the system. It's about the operating system. It's about your storage. It's about the networking. It's about the application layer. It's about the deployment, how it's deployed. It's about the operations, and it's about the users. And the idea behind this is that you need to have a trusted stack all the way from the hardware to the users and applications. And if you don't, then you run the risks of compromise, breach, and lack of trust, in your applications that are running. So just because you may have good controls at the application layer, if you cannot trust the actual hardware that it's running on, well, we've all read about, and name your favorite news story, right, of what's occurred with various agencies around the world, modifying the hardware, that the trust will not be there. And coincidentally, actually yesterday, we announced our latest blog about our Titan chipset, right? on the Google Cloud blog and about our type and tips. It's that how we have the hardened hardware platform, right, to ensure that we can actually have a trusted infrastructure, we have trusted boot, how we can actually ensure that when we load in the operating system and the applications is that it's come from a secure place and it's been cryptographically verified, it's based on trusted firmware and the software stack. And this is the one thing that we think about strongly here at Google is that we want to ensure that we can trust the BIOS, we can trust the firmware in every device and every component, of our software stack. And it's not a complete unknown, because if it is, then you can't have the trust for your data and applications.
How do you basically ensure that the weeds are being watched? Because there's a lot of those stacks represent a really tremendous amount of complexity top to bottom. How do you know, for example, the key generation is happening properly? How do you know if there's a compromise? Like, what are the mechanisms of trust that you build to verify?
This is something that we kind of build into our hardware or our software stack with our hypervisor and our kernel. And so understanding that since we control the keys, right? And so we control the keys and of what the firmware and the microcode in our components, right? And so that they've been digitally signed and we can validate them as we boot the operating system and boot and put the hypervisor in place. So we know in our overall code stack that we've modified that we control to ensure that we do not bring up the system if all these digital signatures have not been validated. And so then if they're not validated or there's been a compromise or there's a check that fails, right, the system will not boot. And therefore not going to load over other guest, virtual machine instances, et cetera, on an untrusted platform.
So if you were a CISO or a CIO now, knowing what you know about Google, if you were just running a 500,000 person company as their digital leader, how would you go about testing or setting up a proof of concept, or like what things would you turn on and start getting to know and understand on the Google platform from a security perspective?
That's a good question. I think of ultimately, it's whether it's the Google platform or others, it's like how you actually build your threat model, understanding your risk. So you understand the risk and threats to your data, and therefore then you can make sure that you will then have the right controls and policies in place so that you can validate the context, of your users, your devices, and applications that should have access to that data. And so that's the way I always like to think about things is before I put something on any application or data, saying, okay, what is my risks? And because if once you understand the risk, then you can say, what policies do I need? And then based on that, what policies you need, then you apply those controls, whether it's roles, whether it's access controls, whether it's strong authentication for your users. Those type of things is the way that I like to think about this at first. And that's the number one way I like to think about this in moving to the cloud or actually even deploying even on-premise.
It's really interesting because I was just in a meeting yesterday and the CIO, she goes, I just want to have a way where my remote offices can patch into the cloud. She said, but I don't want my data going to Box, Dropbox. I want it going right to my cloud storage systems. And so this is the challenge she's faced with. She wants to move to the cloud, but she hasn't figured out how to govern. She wants the data going to a place where she knows it's being backed up, that it's relevant for the business, that she can grab it because it has intellectual property associated with it. And she's got data that's now sliding out into other cloud services. So it's an interesting challenge that it's a very practical challenge, not an easy one to solve necessarily.
Yes. And I think this is one thing that where we're looking at is like other companies is one, this is where like audit logging and things like that also come into play. When you understand of what is occurring and who has access to things and monitoring those things, then you can understand where mistakes may be occurring, where there's improper policies or malicious behavior is going. And building upon that for Google, we're actually trying to move to a model, especially around the world, is what we call a data custodian model. And this is where we're actually partnering with SAP, especially in Europe, is so that we can combine the combination of, Google as a public cloud provider And then with third-party solution providers like SAP, right, so that customers can have the compliance and policies that they need specific to their environment. And so obviously you want to make sure that when you have who has access to the data and where data is going and who has control of that data this is like the two pillars when we say in the data custodian model. And then you can have a third party actually monitoring the compliance to those access controls and long term, right, how they can improve access based on the business justification needed. So that should a cloud provider ever have access to a customer data, you want that to be transparent. And so that in the data custodian model, that someone should monitor that for a customer so that they can have the confidence that their policies are being met and that the only people who have access is the people that have been authorized to have access to their data.
I like the data custodian concept because I'm actually just marrying an earlier part of our conversation, because if you can actually make access validation decisions based on identifiers of software, a key, a device identifier, and you can validate who the person is, then essentially you can say that this is the rights this person, but we need these three elements to be in place, and now you have access to this particular data. Then essentially by default, you'd punt access anywhere else. You're like, if they're going to move data to some place that's not a place that's been identified by the custodian framework, then that would essentially stop that access. Am I looking at this too simplistically, or are we essentially answering the question that she potentially has a challenge to?
We actually think about it in two steps, right? First is just monitoring, because I think there's two cases of where you actually have lots of automated systems, machine learning applications that should have access to the data. And this is where we have what we call the code citing, the code identity, and saying that, yes, this is a trusted application. This is a trusted service. And we know this is a Google service and we trust it. It should have access to our data because it's performing functions on our behalf. There's the second scenario is then, let's say a support professional is trying to help a customer to debug of something that's going wrong with their data or their application. In this case, where it's a professional then has access to the data, and that is a different scenario because it's not based on a trusted application; it's a direct access, and that's one where we say we want to have access transparency. And that is monitoring, someone had access to the data. Let's monitor that and observe that and investigate. Oh, yes, that was a support case. That's a valid access. We're tying it back to the support system, and therefore there's no alert required. But then the second step longer term is then really having the controls, is to ensure that, one, that you've got the right controls of not just what applications can have access, automated, trusted applications can have access to data, but also saying, we need to let a support professional access the data, or we need to have a developer debug a third-party application that has access to the data, but let's approve that in giving the approval of that access, which is very, very important. So that's kind of like we kind of call it our first step of transparency, or access transparency. The second step is about access controls. And so the customer can have that flexibility and confidence it will meet all their policy requirements.
That's great. And one of the pieces you and I talked about, I think I'd asked this in our pre-conversation, was I think there's also a belief that people have that all of a sudden by giving, and this is for all the major cloud vendors, but I'm interested in having this conversation with you because I think people need to understand who's the governor. And our customers of yours, do they need to still have a mentality that they're governing their own systems, even though they're basically outsourcing certain capabilities to you? Do they need to essentially have the responsibility for governing and right use? Or are you seeing people really truly being able to move their information and all of a sudden you can just take over?
Well, when you think about the cloud, there's always going to be shared responsibilities. And the idea is then how you can actually have the best practices, the best automation impossible of the known cases of that. You don't actually have to have a manual granular touch on everything to ensure that you are protected and defended. And that's one aspect of it. But there's another element of where in more complex enterprises that they want much more granular controls, so that they want some people to have access to the data when they're in one country, but they would not want to have the same people to have access when they're in another country because of the risks of being mobile. And so that can only be understood and defined, by the customer based on their regulatory and their security requirements. And so there's always going to be a share there. But the idea is that how we have as many things as possible is an automated best practices format. So it's secure by default and defended by default. And then you have the flexibility to have more granular policies when it's needed based on your specific threats.
Do you feel that there's ever going to be a need to have the public, meaning like FBI, DoD level, the ability for cloud providers like yourselves to be able to suck in the feeds that our nation governing services are using to protect us in theory? Do you feel like the public companies and private cloud companies should be able to pull that data in and use it to their advantage to secure their customers? Do you ever see that happening in the future?
Well, I probably shouldn't comment on that one other than the overall policy is that the one thing like Google, like all cloud providers, I think we follow the natural regulatory and legal requirements that are provided to us. So kind of speculating on those policies would probably be inappropriate for me as an engineer in the cloud.
Sure. Yeah. No, I totally understand that. It's just one of these things that I often noodle is how we essentially marry this into one powerful ecosystem. But what I love is how you're essentially you're architecting and engineering a lot of the pieces here in this framework of security. You've essentially architected it so that you really don't necessarily need the outside information because you're sort of taking it into your own control and providing these ways of mitigating risk, which I find really powerful. If there's like one thing of the topics we've talked about that you think that if a leader, CIO, CISO, VP, director, someone that's in charge of their organization, they should really go dig their heels into and study and research, that you feel is something that's a world-class capability that my listeners really need to understand about Google, what would that be?
I still believe, and I can really credit, of my manager, Niels Provost has talked at GCP Next, conference several times, and it's really about how when you move to the cloud, and we all will be moving to the cloud, it's really how you actually have confidence and transparency, right, in the end-to-end stack, and so that you actually have trust and you have transparency on what is occurring in the end-to-end stack and in the cloud. And that's what our 9-layer stack. And if you don't have transparency and trust in that, then I think that's where your concern should come into play, because then it becomes a complete unknown and a black box, no pun intended, of your move. And then it's very difficult to threat model your risks and apply your policies in such a model.
And I'm going to put links to your RSA presentation on that. I mean, that really gets into the specifics. We're not really going into that, of course, on our show, but I'm going to link out to that. Wouldn't you say that's a good resource for people that kind of gives the visual presentation that you gave at RSA on this?
Absolutely. And also, I'm happy to send you offline here is certainly of the more in-depth of the 9-layer stack. Niels Provost, my manager, has done it at the Google Cloud Next conference. I think it's a nice 20-minute walkthrough of each of those layers as well.
Yeah, that's perfect. What I want to do in the summary blog post is really just, I want to give decision makers what they need, what you feel they really need to understand about the Google model. And I think that's fantastic because you're right. At the end of the day, how can I trust something that I potentially can't touch? And really all you can do is reverse engineer that to prove trust and prove transparency. And it's really a very novel way of addressing that human fear.
Absolutely. And that's how we're going to continue to evolve. And that's how we're going to continue to kind of, be transparent ourselves and sharing more and more of the details of how we approach this, like our blog yesterday about the Titan chipset. And I think what you'll see here in coming months of the things that we're doing, the data custodian model with SAP.
Titan, Titan, right? Titan chip. Is that how you spell that?
Correct.
Titan chip. So last time we talked, just a little bit of personal interest here. You've been very prolific with your inventions through the year. How many patents do you have to your name right now?
Gosh, I don't know if that's good or bad, and saying that I don't know anymore. I think it's around 30. I haven't been traveling on long flights as much recently, but I'm just more and more running because I listen to these podcasts, and sometimes as a long distance runner, when you can listen to some great security podcasts and ideas, it really gets you thinking and how to drive the next innovation in the cloud.
Well, are you able to remember I'm a big runner as well. And someone said to me, he goes, I can tell how productive I am by how many miles I'm running each week. So he knows when he gets over like 6 miles and he's doing that multiple days, that it's actually, he gets more creative. Isn't that interesting?
Yes, exactly. The tricky thing is you got to have in your little running belt a little sticky note, so you can, as you get the ideas, you can put it down there like a napkin, and it's not forgotten.
Oh yeah, right. And one of the tricks that I developed for that, David, and you might use it, is I visualize a drawer, like a dresser drawer, and I literally physically, as I'm running, will visualize myself writing the idea down and then shoving it in the drawer, and then so I can pull it out. My brain knows that it's important and it doesn't get lost.
Excellent. Exactly. And it's sometimes when you get these long 2-hour podcasts, then you collect a lot of them.
Do you race or do you just do training?
Yeah, I like always for the half marathon. I always like, I can run a half marathon every weekend. And it's not about the race, but you have to do a race 2 or 3 times a year just to kind of give you that motivation. You got to have just enough friction. And even though if you're just in a great rhythm, just enough friction really motivates you to get into the next level.
As we wrap up here, is there a takeaway that you want everybody to just really understand moving forward that is sort of what you think is your kind of central thesis that the people listening really should understand, either about something that you want to impart to them that they could take away with and something to be really useful for them?
The number one thing I think I mentioned before is, but I think about your authentication. I think about strong authentication and the fear of phishing. And really everyone should be thinking about, as a business, even if you're a small business or a consumer, is that moving to, strong 2-factor authentication, and like UTF, security keys. It's an important part of the future because we are all going to be phished. And even those of us in the security field can be tempted and fooled. It's very sophisticated. But if you don't move to a 2-factor authentication to protect your account, you will get caught. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And that's the one thing I always like to ask people to think about and focus on going forward.
I actually love that. And I 150% agree with you. Can you just explain though what you mean by a UTF security key? Because you threw that in there. And just so people and even myself understand what you mean by that as a difference from like another security key.
I think this is one under the FIDO, kind of standard that's available. And certainly there's a number of like YubiKey and others that are available, for the Google platform that you can use for Gmail, you can use for Google identities. And certainly for other people, sometimes they use smart cards and USB devices, with X509 certificates. So there's different types. And the UTF FIDO keys are the ones that Google supports with our identities in our cloud.
Oh, awesome. Okay. Yeah, that's great. Well, I 100% agree with you. And I think that's massive reminder for everybody. And well, this has been a real privilege and a pleasure. And I really appreciate for taking the time out. I know it was and every time I have these conversations with kind of the big five, it's always a little bit of a challenge to make sure we got the right context, but I'm so glad we got to and get it approved. But I'm glad we did, and it was a lot of fun.
Absolutely. I love these, Bill. I look forward to the next one and, constantly reconnecting. And I'm also looking forward to the next podcast.
Fantastic, David. Well, take care of yourself and thanks very much.
Thank you.
So there you have it. This wraps another episode of Bill Murphy's Red Zone podcast. To get all the relevant show notes, please go to our blog at www.redzonetech.net/podcasts. Additionally, make sure you go to iTunes and leave your comments in iTunes about the show. This helps our show rankings enormously and it helps support the show. Until next time, appreciate you very much for listening. Thank you.